All right, we're back. My name is Jesse, and today we're doing a case study on a real solar system. In a prior video, I had a viewer, his name's Dewey, reach out to me and had some questions about his existing grid-tied system. He was thinking about maybe trying to do some upgrades, some modifications to the system, just to help it give it some more performance, more production out of his current system. And so normally that's kind of hard because not everybody lives in Arizona. That's where I live, but Dewey actually lives 10 minutes from my house, so that was pretty easy. We were able to meet up. I went to his house and we jumped on his roof, checked out his system, his inverter, his electrical panel, kind of went over some of his kind of electrical consumption. And so that's what we're going to do here is just go over his system, kind of go over some possible modifications he can make to a system, maybe some upgrades, and we'll dive into it. Within this kind of diagram that I just drew out here on this whiteboard, I'll try and put live footage pictures within this video, so just to give you a better idea, but I'll try and zoom in the camera here and then we'll kind of walk through his system. Okay, I forgot to mention earlier that one of the main reasons why Dewey kind of reached out to me was currently in the summer months, June, July, and August, Dewey is still getting a electric bill for, I think he said it's about $350 a month during the hottest times of the year, which is June, July, and August. So it's a little disappointing if you have, a decent sized solar system and you also have a $350 electric bill every month for, the hottest times of the year. So kind of disappointing part is that I don't know how Dewey paid for his solar system, but if you financed your solar system, usually what the solar salesmen are going to tell you is, well, you're not going to have a utility bill anymore, but you'll just have a solar bill because you're financing it. And so it's extremely disappointing if you have a solar bill, which is, we'll just say $200 or $300 a month, on top of a electric bill, which is $350 a month. So I could see why a lot of people who get solar are very frustrated when a solar company, solar installer tells them, hey, you're not going to have a utility bill anymore. You're just going to have your solar bill. And so people, that's actually an excellent way to think about solar. But if the system is not designed properly, which a lot of these systems aren't, that's what happens is you have a electric bill and you have a solar bill, which frustrates people, and then they think solar is a scam, which if you have a system and you have an electric bill and you have a solar bill, the design was bad. So we'll kind of go into Dewey's system here, and I'll just kind of cover some quick highlights real fast. He has REC 325 watt monofacial panels. He's got 37 of them. When we do the math, he's got about a 12,000 watt array, 12,000 watt solar system. Now I did look at his inverter. He has a SolarEdge inverter, but I forgot to look at the actual specs on it. Just based off the pictures, I think it's a 7,600 watt inverter. It could be a bigger one, but I don't think it is. The other bigger ones I saw were like 11.4 kilowatt inverters, but I don't think his is. Just based off the pictures I saw, his looks very close to a 7,600 watt inverter. I'll put a picture within this video, and you guys, some of you guys who've got grid-tied systems or work in solar, you guys, let me know what you guys think. But it appears to be a 7,600 watt SolarEdge inverter, and that's a choke point immediately on this system. Dewey, he's capable of making 12,000 watts. No system is actually 100% efficient, but I could see him being 90, 80% efficient on really good days. And so if you're 80, 90% efficient, you should be making close to 10,000 watts during maybe noon or 1 o'clock when you're getting really good sun. So if you're making 10,000 watts and you have a choke point here with the inverter that's only capable of using 7,600 watts, well, this inverter is just going to clip the rest of the 10,000 watts that you're probably making, and it's only going to feed 7,600 watts to your house, to your electrical panel to use, or it's going to send the rest to APS, the utility company, to sell back. But there's a kind of big choke point here. So this is an option. You could upgrade this inverter here to a larger one, but for some reason, grid-tied inverters, especially SolarEdge ones, they're expensive. I don't know what how much it's going to cost, but just on some simple research I've done, they're like $3 or $4 grand for an 11 kilowatt inverter, and that would give you a little bump. But personally, I would, if I'm going to spend $3 or $4 grand, I'm not going to spend $3 or $4 grand for a grid-tied inverter. I'd much rather go with an off-grid inverter that has grid backup, and I'd invest my money that way. But that's an option. You could go that route to make more use of your solar during peak hours. I think the reason why they just over panel is because throughout the day you'll just make more. But during peak hours, your inverter is going to clip a lot of the excess solar that it can't handle. And so Dewey's kind of configuration here is this L-shaped kind of layout. The bulk of the roof real estate is this section here. The front yard is kind of this. If you were looking at his house from the street, this west side of the roof is the front yard, and then the backyard is the east side of the roof. And then this small L-shaped kind of wing of the house has this section here of the roof that is south facing, which is a really good spot, but there's no solar panels. I'll kind of give you a theory of why I think the solar company didn't install in here. But Dewey's got 2 arrays on the west side here of the roof. So he's got 26 solar panels here on the west side. 26 times 325, he's got over 8,000 watts of solar over here on the west side of the roof. And then on the east side of the roof, he's got 11 panels. 11 times 325, you've got 3,575. So 3,000 watts of solar on the east side of the roof. So just really quickly, we'll kind of walk through kind of what's happening here. We're going to say that at noon, he's going to be making, close to 12,000 watts, maybe 10,000, 9,000 watts on a good day. He's going to send 10,000 watts of DC current down to this SolarEdge inverter. This SolarEdge inverter is on the north side of the house. And the SolarEdge inverter is going to convert that DC power to alternating current. So it's going to send, you're getting 10,000 watts off the roof going to the SolarEdge inverter, and it converts that DC power to 10,000 watts, we're going to say, to AC power. And the SolarEdge inverter is just going to send that AC power to the main electrical panel. The main electrical panel is probably like 20 feet away, and it's going to send it to a 60 amp breaker. And I'll put a picture in here of what the electrical panel looks like. But this electrical panel is going to take that alternating current, and whatever the house uses, it's going to be supplied by the SolarEdge inverter. But whatever the house doesn't use, it'll just sell back to APS. And so that's kind of our configuration here. It's not really a flaw in the design. It's just something you have to think about. If your house has a configuration like this, where your only real estate to put solar is on the east or west side, and you don't have a good south-facing location, then you just have to accept that if you have a 12,000 watt array and it's split up between east and west, you're probably gonna only make 60, maybe 70% of what it's actually capable of making. And that's because of this east-west side split. And so in Dewey's case, this black dotted line is the ridge of the roof. The ridge of the roof is the highest point in the roof. And so the solar panels are mounted on either side of the ridge. And so in the morning, the ridge of the roof shades all these panels on the west side. And in the afternoon, the ridge of the roof starts to shade this east side of the roof. There's probably an hour or 2 hours, maybe around noon, 1 o'clock, where the ridge is not really shading anything. And so both of these arrays are going to be cranking out a bunch of power. But once you start to get late in the afternoon, early in the morning, the ridge starts to become a factor, and it starts to shade a lot of these panels. And then I didn't draw it in here, but somewhere right here, there's a big air conditioning unit, a roof-mounted air conditioning unit. And that's also going to shade a bunch of these panels once you get past noon. And so not much Dewey can really do. If you have this type of east-west type roof, you just have to accept that you're going to have a loss, because the ridge is going to shade a bunch of your system in the morning and a bunch of your system in the afternoon. They did put a bulk of his solar on the west side of the roof, which is, I think, probably the best, given this configuration. That's the best location, primarily because in the afternoons it's really, really hot outside in Arizona, and so that's when your air conditioner, that's when you're going to be using a lot of electricity to cool your house. And so you want a bulk of your kind of solar helping you out in the afternoon. In the morning, it's still hot outside, but it's cooler. But once you start getting into 1, 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, man, it's super hot, and you want these panels to really help you out. So that's kind of what Dewey's running into, is he's just getting shading from the ridge here of the roof, and not much you can really do about that. However, on this wing of the house here, this side of the roof here is south facing, and I asked Dewey if he would consider trimming this tree and removing it, because there is a tree here and it does shade part of this south of the roof, and he actually doesn't like that tree. He mentioned that he thinks that tree is way too close to the house and he's been wanting to get rid of it. So it would have been nice if the solar installers would ask Dewey, but I just feel like most solar companies, they don't want to have to deal with removing trees and having to get rid of it. They'd much rather just over panel as much as they can, and that does two things. It kind of overcomes any efficiencies in the design, and it also bloats the cost of the system because they can sell you more panels, and they can also market it as you have a really big system, when in reality it's not really that big. It's just inflated with more panels that are just less efficient. And so one of the kind of other options I had mentioned to Dewey was we would remove this tree, trim it, or give it some sort of a haircut so it's not shading any of this south side roof. And then what he could do is just remove, unbolt, and unwire these 11 solar panels, use the same solar panels, the same mounting hardware, and just place those 11 right here. And now that the tree's gone, this array here on the south side is going to get excellent solar production all morning and even into the late evening. You might get some shading from the ridge here, maybe late in the afternoon, but Dewey's system has DC optimizers, so even in the late afternoon, he may get some shading on maybe a couple of these panels, but because he's got DC optimizers, like the rest of this array is still going to be, cranking out a bunch of electricity. So it's the best location for solar, primarily because it's south facing and we're not getting any shade until the very, very late afternoon. And even when you do get shade, he's got the optimizers that will just they'll take that solar panel out of the equation. Where he's got optimizers on this side of the roof, but the way the shading happens is the shading, you don't get to remove. We'll just take this array. For instance, this array here, in the afternoon, you're going to start getting shading here. But the optimizers, they're not really going to help you remove one or two panels away. They're not able to be as effective because the shading is across all these panels evenly. The optimizers work best when you have shading on like one panel or shading on two panels, because it'll just kind of remove those two panels out of the equation, but it's not going to drag the entire production of the array. And so that's the downfall here. But the upside here on the south side of the roof is if you do have some shading, it's going to be one panel at a time. And so the optimizers will just kind of remove that panel from the array because it's being shaded, but you still get excellent solar production from the rest of the array. That's kind of the budget-friendly alternative that I had mentioned to Dewey. It wouldn't cost that much money. It's just a decent amount of labor to unbolt this, bolt the mounting hardware here, use all the existing hardware, the existing panels. We would just make a small little junction box here, because from here to here is probably like 25 feet. So you would just have to extend your PV wires from here to here. So you might spend about $100. You might have to buy like 50 feet of PV wire just to make this extension. But you'd get a nice, if I had to guess, 10% bump or 15% bump in your overall solar production. And it wouldn't cost a lot of money. I mean, you'd spend $100 on some wiring, a junction box. It'd be a decent amount of labor, but you get a nice 10% bump on your production throughout the day, just for making this one move here to this side of the roof and just removing this tree or just trimming it enough to where the tree is not shading any of this. The other option, which is more expensive, it's kind of more of a premium. It's what I would do if this was my house. This is what I would do. I would leave the existing grid tied system the way it is. I wouldn't mess with it. All I would do is buy an off-grid inverter with the kind of grid backup capabilities, kind of like a 12,000 XP, and then I would put 450, 500 watt panels all along the south side of the roof. And then I'd add a couple server rack batteries, maybe 2 or 3. I'd probably spend $2 or $3 grand on the inverter, $2 or $3 grand on some batteries, and then I'd make a small little sub panel here next to my main electrical panel, and I would just move over some high energy circuits like the pool pump. Dewey has a pool, and so pool pumps run 10, 12 hours a day, and they use a ton of electricity. And so I would move that circuit over, and that would take a huge load off of the grid tied system, and that would be primarily run by our off-grid system. And then I could move over some small, maybe lighting circuits, the fridge, just, as a backup in case the power went out, they would still be on. And I could move over, the hot water heater, the dryers, maybe some other high energy circuits that could be powered by our off-grid inverter, our off-grid array, our battery backup. It'd kind of be isolated, and this would kind of function on its own, wouldn't really interact or interfere with anything with our grid tied system. That's the other kind of downside with these grid tied systems is if the power goes out, well, your solar system is worthless because your solar system is tied to the utility company. And if the utility company power goes out for whatever reason, there's a storm, there's a power line that goes down, whatever the case is, they can't have you pushing back electricity to the grid while they're trying to repair power lines, transformers. They're trying to repair stuff that broke. They have to ensure that your system is also offline. So that's the downfall with grid-tied systems, is if the power goes out in your neighborhood from the utility company, your system also is not going to work, regardless of how much sun is outside. But if you have an off-grid system, that doesn't matter because you're not ever trying to sell back electricity. Your electricity is primarily used for self-consumption and battery storage. And so if the power goes out, it doesn't matter. Your system still functions as normal. Your lights will go on, your refrigerator goes on, your pumps, water heaters, dryers, whatever's being powered by this off-grid inverter will continue to work as long as the sun goes out. It doesn't really matter what the utility company is going through. I'm sure there's a bunch of other options. These are just a couple that I had brought up, what I would do. The other one I had mentioned to Dewey was he could do what we did with our N-phase microinverters. He could build a small little solar pergola, add 2 or 3 microinverters to wire into his pool pump timer, and while the pool pump is running during the day, those microinverters will just feed back electricity. And because Dewey has an interconnection agreement, he can sell back electricity. It doesn't really matter. And if he only does 3 or 4 microinverters, it's never going to be enough where it's going to notify the utility company that he's pushing back all this electricity, because his pump for the most part is going to use all that electricity that's being made by those small microinverters. But that's the other thing I had mentioned to Dewey is with this type of setup that he has, you're better off using as much electricity as you can during the day, especially during the afternoon, because that's when his big 2 arrays on the west side of the roof are helping him out the most. The last thing you want to do is be using a lot of electricity at night because of your interconnection agreement, or your net metering rates. Sorry, your net metering rates. I think Dewey had mentioned that his net metering kind of rates that he's locked into are, he buys electricity at 17 cents a kilowatt hour, and then he sells back electricity at 4 cents a kilowatt hour. And so that's a kind of terrible exchange that you have to participate in, but that's pretty normal. Unless you have a true one-to-one net metering rate where you buy at a certain rate and you get to sell back at that same exact certain rate, that's awesome. But most net metering rates are like Dewey's. You have to buy electricity at a high price, but when you get to sell back electricity, they don't buy it at the same rate. They buy it at pennies on the dollar. And that's just the way the industry is going. I have a theory of why I think it's going that way, and I'll try to leave a link in the video here as to, if you want to learn more about it. But most electric companies, they kind of rig it in their favor, where, the net metering rate favors them, not you. And that's just the way that the solar industry is going. Those one-to-one net metering rates are going away, and everybody's getting stuck with these, unfavorable rates where you buy high, but you get to sell back low. Let's see, something else I was going to mention here real quick. I forgot to mention that Dewey had also asked if we could just, replace a bunch of these solar panels with bigger ones, 400 or 500 watt solar panels. And that's an option. You can do that. But typically when you have a grid tied system, you sign a contract, and that contract entails how big your system is. So if you sign a contract and it says your system is 12,000 watts, you're capped at that. You can't 5 years later just put some 500 watt solar panels here and now your system's 15,000 watts. You're limited to what you signed your contract at. I think there's a little wiggle room to go like 5% or 10% more, but if you're going to replace a bunch of solar panels, you're not going to go 5% bigger. You're going to want to go as big as you can. And you can't do that if you sign that contract. You can renegotiate a new contract that allows you to put a bigger system, 15,000 or 20,000 watts of solar, but your net metering rate is going to change. And so I think Dewey's rate was 17 cents, is which he buys electricity at, and he gets to sell back at 4 cents. So if you renegotiate a new contract, you're probably not going to get those rates. Your rates are probably going to be that you get to buy electricity at like 20 cents and you get to sell back at 2 cents. It's going to be, I don't know exactly what it is, but Dewey's grandfathered into those initial rates that he locked into 4 or 5 years ago whenever he installed the system. But um, if you renegotiate a new contract, it's very likely that you're not going to have your same old rates. You're probably going to have rates that are less in your favor. So that's something to consider. And then when you renegotiate a new contract, there's usually fees and all sorts of costs you got to consider. But it's an option. You can go that route, but I wouldn't do that. Yeah, I think that's gonna wrap this one up. You guys put some comments in there on some suggestions and let us know if there's some other options out there. It's gonna wrap this one up. I will catch you guys on the next one.